Sarah Mitchell stood poised at the boarding gate of Luxair Airlines Flight 512 to London on April 2, 2025, her navy blue uniform pressed neatly, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that reflected her disciplined demeanor. At 38, she was a seasoned flight attendant with 15 years of experience, a position she carried with quiet pride. Luxair wasn't merely an airline, it was a beacon of luxury and exclusivity, particularly for its first-class passengers. Sarah excelled in this world, her keen instincts and polished charm setting her apart. She could spot a demanding passenger from a distance, anticipate their needs, and manage their expectations with a smile that rarely wavered. The buzz of JFK Airport's Terminal 3 surrounded her as passengers flowed past, businessmen in tailored suits, families with restless children, tourists clutching guidebooks. Sarah's eyes scanned the crowd, assessing who might need extra care, who might complain about the meal, who might disrupt her carefully honed routine. It was a ritual she'd mastered over the years, a dance of observation and control as she prepared to board the Boeing 787 Dreamliner for its transatlantic journey. Then her gaze settled on the Carter family. Daniel Carter, a tall man with a reserved presence, wore a simple gray suit that fit him well but lacked the ostentatious flair Sarah associated with first-class travelers. Beside him stood Olivia Carter, her black dress elegant yet understated, her posture radiating calm confidence. Their two children, an 8-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl, stood close, their small hands gripping backpacks adorned with cartoon characters. They weren't loud or disruptive, but something about them caught Sarah's attention, stirring an unease she couldn't name. As the Carters approached the gate, Sarah glanced at their boarding passes. First class, seats 1G and 1H for the adults, 1J and 1K for the children. The tickets were valid, the barcode scanning without issue. Yet a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. They didn't look like the typical first-class clientele she was used to, executives with designer watches, celebrities dripping with entitlement, or old-money families exuding authority. Daniel's suit was too plain, Olivia's dress too modest. Sarah's instincts, sharpened by years of serving the elite, whispered that they didn't belong. "Could you step aside for a moment?" Sarah asked, her tone firm but polite, her smile tight. She held up a hand, gesturing them out of the line. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Is there a problem?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She rescanned their tickets, the machine beeping its confirmation once more. "I just need to confirm your reservation," she said, her voice clipped. "There seems to be some confusion." Olivia exchanged a quick glance with her husband, her dark eyes narrowing briefly before softening. She said nothing, guiding the children to the side with a gentle touch as Sarah stepped away to consult a supervisor. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the line behind the Carters grew restless. Whispers rippled through the crowd, "What's the holdup? Why are they singled out?" But Sarah ignored them, her focus locked on the family. The supervisor, a busy woman named Claire, raised an eyebrow as their codes checked out. "They're valid, Sarah. What's the issue?" Sarah shifted her weight, lowering her voice. "I just want to be sure. They don't seem like the usual first-class type." Claire sighed but nodded. "Fine, but make it quick. We're on a schedule." When Sarah returned, her smile was colder, her decision made. "Follow me," she said, but instead of leading them to the plush first-class seats near the front, she directed them to the last row of the section, near the restrooms and far from the expansive windows. It was a subtle, calculated move, meant to send a message: "You don't fit here." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, guiding his family to their new seats. Olivia adjusted her daughter's backpack, her movements deliberate, her expression unreadable. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the night sky, Sarah felt a strange satisfaction. She'd asserted her authority, maintained the order she believed Luxair's first-class experience demanded. Yet beneath that satisfaction, a faint unease lingered, a whisper she couldn't silence. She told herself it was about standards, about preserving the cabin's exclusivity, but deep down, she knew it was something more, something she wasn't ready to confront. The cabin of Flight 512 settled into its rhythm as the plane reached cruising altitude. The soft hum of the engines blended with the clink of champagne flutes and the murmur of conversation. Sarah moved through the aisles with practiced grace, offering drinks, adjusting pillows, and exchanging pleasantries with passengers. She prided herself on this, making the wealthy feel wealthier, the important feel more significant. It was her domain, and she ruled it with precision. But her eyes kept drifting to the Carters. They sat quietly in their reassigned seats, Daniel engrossed in a paperback novel, Olivia helping their son with a coloring book while their daughter napped against her arm. They weren't disruptive, didn't demand attention, didn't even press the call button excessively. If anything, they were the model of composure, more so than the boisterous tech mogul in 2A who'd already requested a third refill or the heiress in 3C who'd complained about the wine selection within the first hour. Yet Sarah couldn't shake her irritation. She retreated to the galley, where Emily, a newer flight attendant with wide eyes and an eager-to-please attitude, was pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses. Emily's movements were careful, her focus intense. "Everything okay out there?" she asked, glancing up at Sarah. Sarah hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "You saw that family in the last row of first class, right?" Emily nodded, her brow creasing slightly. "Yeah, they seem nice." "What about them?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Doesn't it feel off? I mean, first class isn't cheap, and they're just, well, you know." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Emily frowned, unsure how to respond. "They have valid tickets, don't they?" "Of course," Sarah snapped, rolling her eyes. "But that doesn't mean anything these days. People game the system all the time. I've seen it before, passengers who scrape together miles or points and think they can sneak into first class. They don't belong here." Emily paused, her hand stilling over the tray. "I don't know, Sarah. They haven't done anything wrong." Sarah waved her off. "You don't get it. I've been doing this long enough to know when something's not right." She didn't elaborate, but her conviction was palpable. She'd dealt with passengers who didn't fit before, those who'd somehow wormed their way into the elite cabin, and she prided herself on weeding them out. The Carters, she decided, were no different. As the flight progressed, Sarah's subtle hostility became more apparent. When the Carters pressed the call button to request water for their son, she took her time responding, lingering with other passengers first. She chatted with the tech mogul about his latest startup, refilled the heiress's wine glass with exaggerated care, and only then made her way to the last row. When she finally brought the water, she set it down with a curt nod, avoiding eye contact. Olivia murmured a polite, "Thank you," but Sarah was already moving away, her shoulders stiff. Daniel leaned closer to his wife, his voice a whisper. "They're watching us." Olivia nodded, her expression calm. "Let them," she replied softly. "We've dealt with worse." Sarah didn't hear their exchange, but she felt their presence like a thorn in her side. She couldn't explain it, there was no logical reason for her unease, but it gnawed at her, eroding the control she usually wielded so effortlessly. She told herself it was about maintaining the integrity of first class, about ensuring the experience matched the price tag, but deep down, she knew it was something else. Something personal. Something she couldn't yet name. The dinner service began 3 hours into the flight, and Sarah's actions grew more pointed. She brought out trays of gourmet meals, chicken with truffle sauce, grilled salmon with herb butter, and a vegetarian risotto, delivering them with a smile to each passenger in first class. She chatted with the tech mogul about his meal preferences, complimented the heiress on her choice of wine pairing, and ensured every tray was placed with care. But when it came to the Carters, her routine changed. She deliberately delayed their service, lingering with other rows, refilling drinks, and adjusting napkins for passengers who didn't need the extra attention. The Carters' menus sat untouched on their tray tables as the rest of first class dug into their meals. Olivia glanced around discreetly, noticing how swiftly the other passengers were served, how their laughter and clinking cutlery filled the cabin while their row remained overlooked. She leaned over to Daniel and whispered, "This isn't a coincidence." Daniel sighed, leaning back in his seat and crossing his arms. "I know," he muttered, his voice calm but frustration evident in his eyes. "Let's not give her the satisfaction of seeing us upset." When Sarah finally reached them, her expression was neutral, but her body language was stiff. "I apologize for the delay," she said curtly, setting their menus down with a sharpness that was subtle but noticeable. "We've had a bit of a backlog in the galley. Can I take your order now?" Olivia smiled politely, her tone unwavering. "Yes, of course." She and Daniel placed their orders, chicken for him, salmon for her, and simpler meals for the children, speaking in the same calm, composed manner they'd maintained since boarding. Sarah jotted down their choices quickly and left without the usual warmth she reserved for other passengers. As the meal service continued, the Carters received their plates last, the delay glaring. The chicken was noticeably colder, the salmon less vibrant than what the others had enjoyed. Olivia cut into her dish with practiced ease, while Daniel offered a small smile to his wife, appreciating her grace in the face of such obvious disrespect. Their children remained quiet, as if sensing their parents' mood and mirroring their calmness. A man in his 50s, dressed in a sharp pinstripe suit, sat in 4B, sipping a glass of whiskey. He'd been watching Sarah's interactions with quiet interest, his graying hair and piercing blue eyes giving him an air of authority. He noticed the delays in service to the Carters, the way their meals arrived late and cold, the way Sarah's smile never reached her eyes when she approached them. He set his drink down and flagged down Emily, who was passing by. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Can I ask why the family in the last row was served so late? It's not hard to notice." Emily froze, her eyes darting to Sarah, who stood nearby adjusting a tray. Sarah turned, her face tightening. "I assure you, sir, everything is under control," she said quickly, her tone smooth but defensive. The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Under control? It looks to me like there's a deliberate effort to ignore them. Do you think that's appropriate for passengers who paid for first class?" Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she forced a smile. "I'm sorry if it appeared that way, sir. That wasn't the intention." He studied her for a moment, then shook his head subtly and returned to his meal. Sarah felt a jolt of unease, his words cutting deeper than she'd expected. She retreated to the galley, her composure fraying. "Who does he think he is?" she muttered to Emily, who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The rest of the flight passed in a haze of tension. Sarah tried to focus on her duties, collecting trays, dimming lights, preparing the cabin for the overnight leg, but her thoughts kept circling back to the Carters and the man's pointed comment. The cabin grew quiet, passengers settling into sleep or movies, but Sarah's nerves buzzed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something she couldn't control. In the galley, she vented to Emily again. "I don't understand why they're acting so entitled," she muttered, her voice low but bitter. "It's not like they're royalty." Emily, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated before replying. "I don't think they're acting entitled," she said carefully. "They're just normal passengers. Maybe we should treat them like everyone else." Sarah shot her a sharp look. "You don't understand. I've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't feel right." She didn't elaborate, but the words hung in the air. Emily paused, then retreated to the cabin, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. Unbeknownst to Sarah, Daniel had quietly risen from his seat and made his way to the front of the plane, speaking briefly with the captain's assistant. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but there was a quiet intensity in his request. The assistant nodded and escorted him to the cockpit, where he had a brief, private conversation with the captain. When Daniel returned to his seat, Olivia raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. She trusted her husband's judgment and knew that whatever he had planned would be handled with the same quiet dignity they'd shown all evening. Sarah, still oblivious to the conversation in the cockpit, continued her rounds. The other passengers in first class appeared relaxed, but there was a growing sense of awareness among them. Some began to notice the subtle dynamics at play, the way Sarah seemed to bristle whenever she approached the Carters, the way their service lagged behind the rest. Whispers grew louder, though no one confronted her directly. As the plane sailed through the night sky, the cracks in Sarah's carefully maintained facade began to show. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had underestimated this family, but she couldn't figure out why. The question gnawed at her, pulling her focus away from her duties. She told herself it was about protecting the first-class experience, but the more she repeated that excuse, the hollower it sounded. As the plane began its gradual descent toward Heathrow Airport, Sarah busied herself with final preparations, collecting trash, assisting passengers, ensuring the cabin was secure. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her gaze kept drifting to the Carters. Daniel and Olivia woke their children, who rubbed sleepy eyes and peered out the window at the sprawling lights of London below. Daniel slipped his phone into his pocket, exchanging a glance with Olivia, subtle but deliberate, as if they'd silently agreed on their next steps. Sarah stood at the exit as the cabin doors opened, her professional smile plastered on as she bid farewell to the first-class passengers. The man in the pinstripe suit passed by, giving her a long, unreadable look but saying nothing. When the Carters approached, Sarah stiffened. Daniel paused, meeting her gaze directly. "Thank you for the flight," he said, his tone steady but edged with something she couldn't place. Olivia nodded courteously, her eyes calm, and then they were gone. Moments later, a junior flight attendant approached Sarah, her expression puzzled. "The captain wants to see you in the cockpit," she said quietly. "He said it's urgent." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Now? What for?" "I don't know," the attendant replied, shrugging. But he was insistent. Swallowing her panic, Sarah adjusted her uniform and made her way to the cockpit. The hum of the plane's systems greeted her as she stepped inside. Captain David Brooks, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, sat with the co-pilot, reviewing paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Take a seat, Sarah," Brooks said, nodding to the jump seat. She sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We've received a message from corporate," he began, his tone firm. "It concerns the passengers in row 1G and 1H. Sarah's stomach dropped. "The Carters?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Brooks nodded. "They're not just passengers, Sarah. Daniel and Olivia Carter are the majority stakeholders in Luxair Airlines. They recently acquired the company and were on this flight for an incognito evaluation of staff performance. From what I've heard, their experience wasn't up to standard." Sarah blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. "Owners?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Yes," Brooks said, his tone sharpening. "And they've requested a meeting with you before they leave the airport. This is out of my hands now." Sarah's hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. A meeting with the owners, people she'd judged, dismissed, and mistreated without a second thought. Her carefully constructed world tilted, and for the first time in years, she felt the ground beneath her crumble. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. There was no defense, no excuse. She'd been caught, and the consequences were closing in. Captain Brooks escorted Sarah through the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the metal floor. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows, mirroring the dread pooling in her chest. Whispers from the crew trailed behind her. "Did you hear? She messed with the wrong people, and she fought to keep her head high." The VIP lounge loomed ahead, its glass doors sliding open with a soft hiss. Inside, Daniel and Olivia Carter sat in plush armchairs, their children absent, likely with a nanny or assistant. Daniel's posture was relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, while Olivia sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady and commanding. Sarah stepped forward, her confidence replaced by a raw vulnerability she couldn't mask. "Have a seat," Daniel said, nodding to the chair across from them. Sarah sat, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. Olivia spoke first, her voice cool but measured. "Sarah, is it?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, her throat dry. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes piercing. "I'd like to ask you a simple question. Why do you think we're here?" Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing for an escape that didn't exist. I understand there were issues during the flight," she said, her voice faltering. "I may have mishandled some aspects of your service." "Mishandled?" Olivia repeated, her tone sharp with disbelief. "This isn't about a delayed drink or a seat change. This is about respect, or the lack of it. You treated us like we didn't belong. Am I wrong?" Sarah opened her mouth to deny it, but the words died on her lips. "No, sir," she admitted quietly. "You're not wrong." Olivia's expression softened slightly, but her words cut deep. "Do you know how often we've faced this? We've built a life where we shouldn't have to prove ourselves, but people like you still make us feel like intruders." "Why?" Sarah's throat tightened, shame washing over her. She had no answer, no defense. Daniel's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "This isn't just about us. It's about every passenger who's been judged because of someone else's prejudice. As owners, we can't let that stand in our airline." Sarah's eyes widened, panic surging. "Mr. Carter, please," she stammered. "This was a mistake. I've been with Luxair for 15 years. I'm good at my job. I can learn from this." Olivia's gaze hardened. 15 years, and what have you learned? Clearly not how to treat people fairly. Daniel raised a hand, his tone softening. We'll take this to corporate. Your actions will be reviewed, and they'll decide your future here. But know this, your behavior reflects on the entire company, and that's something we can't ignore. Sarah nodded, her hands shaking. As the Carters stood to leave, she remained frozen, their words echoing in her mind. She'd misjudged them, and now she faced the consequences. The lounge felt smaller, the air heavier, as the reality of her actions settled over her like a suffocating fog. The days following the flight were a blur of dread and isolation. Sarah was suspended with pay pending a corporate review, the email from Luxair's HR department a cold, formal blow. She stayed in her small Brooklyn apartment, the silence suffocating. Her phone buzzed with notifications, texts from coworkers asking what happened, calls from her mother wondering why she hadn't checked in, but she ignored them, unable to face the questions. She replayed the flight over and over in her mind, each moment a fresh wound. The way she'd singled out the Carters at the gate, the way she delayed their service, the way she dismissed them without a second thought. She'd always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to read people and maintain control, but now that pride felt hollow. She'd been wrong, terribly, irrevocably wrong, and the weight of that realization crushed her. On the third day, an email from Emily broke through her haze. Hi Sarah, I heard about the suspension. Hope you're okay. Let me know if you want to talk. Sarah stared at the message, a flicker of warmth piercing her numbness. She typed a brief reply, thanks, Emily. It's been rough. Maybe soon. That evening, desperate for air, Sarah wandered into the city, her feet carrying her aimlessly through the streets of Brooklyn. She ended up at a quiet coffee shop in Park Slope, a place she'd visited countless times during layovers. She sat in the corner, nursing a latte, trying to drown out the storm in her head. But a conversation nearby jolted her back to reality. Did you hear about the Luxair thing? A woman said, leaning forward conspiratorially. The owners were on a flight, and the crew totally screwed up. They're this successful black couple, and the staff had no idea who they were. Talk about karma, another replied, laughing softly. You can't treat people like that and expect it not to bite you. Sarah's stomach twisted. The story was spreading, her failure becoming public fodder. She set her cup down, her appetite gone, and stared at the table. If strangers were already talking about it, how far would it go? Would her name be attached to the scandal? The idea of being publicly associated with this mistake sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She left the coffee shop in a daze, the conversation playing on repeat in her mind. The city lights blurred as she walked home, her steps heavy. She'd spent 15 years building a career, a reputation, an identity, and now it was unraveling, thread by thread. When she reached her apartment, she collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as the reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy fog. A week later, the final email arrived. Your employment with Luxair Airlines is terminated effective immediately, it read, citing violations of inclusivity policies and damage to the company's reputation. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill. 15 years, gone in an instant. She dropped the phone onto the coffee table, her hands trembling. It was done. Her career, her life as she'd known it, was over. The termination left Sarah adrift, her identity as a flight attendant, the confident, capable woman she'd been, shattered. She spent days locked in her apartment, the walls closing in, the silence growing louder with each passing hour. Her phone became both a lifeline and a tormentor, buzzing with messages she couldn't bring herself to answer. She avoided calls from her mother, texts from co-workers, even a voicemail from an old friend asking if she was okay. The shame of admitting her suspension, now her termination, kept her isolated, trapped with her thoughts. On the 5th day, a knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, peering through the peephole. It was Emily, holding a paper bag from a local bakery, the logo stamped on the side. Sarah opened the door, her voice hoarse from days of disuse. "Emily? I figured you could use something sweet," Emily said with a tentative smile. "It's not much, but—" Sarah stepped aside, letting her in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the bakery bag between them, the silence heavy. Emily broke it first. "I heard about the termination. I'm really sorry, Sarah. I know this must be a lot to handle." Sarah exhaled shakily, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "It's not like I didn't see it coming. I made my choices, and now I'm paying for them." Emily nodded, her expression compassionate. "You're not the only one who's ever made a mistake, Sarah. You're just in a situation where it was impossible to hide from the consequences." Sarah looked up, her eyes searching Emily's face. "Do you think I'm a bad person? Because of what I did?" Emily paused, considering her words carefully. "I don't think you're a bad person, Sarah. I think you've been carrying biases you didn't even realize you had, and when they got challenged, you acted in a way that hurt people. But recognizing that, that's the first step toward being better." Sarah blinked, her throat tightening. "What if it's too late? What if I've ruined everything?" "It's not too late," Emily said firmly. "You lost your job, yes, but you didn't lose your ability to learn, to grow, to change. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work to make that happen?" The words hung in the air, heavy but not crushing. For the first time since her termination, Sarah felt a small flicker of hope, not because the situation had resolved, but because she realized she still had a choice. Emily stayed for a while, the two of them sharing the pastries and talking about lighter things, old flights, funny passengers, the quirks of the job. When she left, Sarah sat alone, the bakery bag still on the table, the quiet advice Emily had given echoing in her mind. That night, Sarah turned on her laptop, the screen casting a soft glow in the dim room. She stared at the blank search bar, unsure where to start, then slowly typed "unconscious bias." The results flooded in: articles, studies, training programs, personal essays. She clicked on one, then another, and soon she was immersed in stories of people who'd recognized their own biases and worked to overcome them. Each story was different, but a common thread ran through them: change wasn't easy, but it was possible. She read late into the night, her eyes burning but her mind alive with new thoughts. One article, written by a woman who'd faced prejudice in her career and turned it into a force for good, struck her deeply. The woman had started an organization to foster inclusivity in workplaces, using her experience to help others. Sarah bookmarked the page, her fingers trembling slightly. For the first time, she considered that maybe, just maybe, she could do something with her failure, turn it into something meaningful. The next morning, Sarah woke with a strange mix of dread and determination. She knew what she needed to do, but the first step felt monumental. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't called in months: her older sister, Rachel, a diversity and inclusion consultant. Their relationship had frayed over the years, strained by Sarah's rigid attitude and her dismissive stance toward Rachel's work. She'd always seen it as soft or unnecessary, a luxury problem for people with too much time. Now, she saw how wrong she'd been. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. Would Rachel even want to hear from her after all this time? But Emily's words replayed in her mind. You didn't lose your ability to learn, to grow, to change, and she pressed the button, holding the phone to her ear. It rang twice before Rachel answered, her voice cautious. Sarah? This is a surprise. Rachel, hi, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. I know it's been a while. I need to talk to you. If you're willing to listen. A pause stretched across the line, and Sarah braced herself for rejection. But then Rachel's voice softened. I'm listening. Sarah didn't hold back. For the first time, she let herself be vulnerable, admitting the mistakes she'd made, the flight, the Carters, the biases she hadn't acknowledged, the consequences that had shattered her career. She didn't try to excuse herself or shift blame, she simply told the truth. When she finished, Rachel was quiet for a moment. It takes courage to admit what you just did, Rachel said finally. Most people don't even get to that point. But you need to understand that this isn't about fixing one moment. It's about unlearning years of behavior and committing to real change. That's a long road. I know, Sarah said, her voice steady but raw. But I don't want to be the person I was. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. Rachel sighed, and Sarah could almost hear the shift in her tone, the cautious hope. If you're serious about this, I can help. But it's going to take work. Are you ready for that? I'm ready, Sarah replied, and for the first time in weeks, she believed it. Rachel began outlining steps Sarah could take, resources to explore, courses to enroll in, conversations to have with herself and others. Sarah listened intently, jotting down notes, already envisioning a different version of herself, one that wasn't defined by her mistakes but by the effort to correct them. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Sarah threw herself into the process. She enrolled in an online course on unconscious bias, spending hours each night watching lectures and completing exercises. The lessons stung, holding a mirror to the attitudes and assumptions she'd carried for years, but instead of retreating, she leaned in. She read articles, attended webinars, and even joined a local discussion group focused on creating inclusive communities. For the first time, she was listening to voices she'd once dismissed, and their stories shifted her perspective in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as she flipped through her notes from a webinar, Sarah came across the contact information for a nonprofit organization focused on workplace equity. She hesitated, unsure of what she could offer, but then dialed the number. When the director picked up, Sarah explained her situation honestly, her years in the airline industry, the mistakes she'd made, her desire to contribute to meaningful change. To her surprise, the director was encouraging. People who are willing to own their mistakes and learn from them are exactly the kind of allies we need, they said. Why don't you come by next week? Let's talk. That meeting marked the beginning of Sarah's second chapter. She started volunteering with the nonprofit, using her experience in the airline industry to help develop training programs for businesses. Her role was small at first, reviewing materials, offering feedback, but as she grew more confident, she took on larger responsibilities, speaking at workshops, mentoring younger professionals, and even helping to draft policies aimed at promoting equity in the workplace. 2 years passed, and Sarah's life looked unrecognizable. The woman who'd once stood so firmly in her self-assured authority was now navigating a world of self-discovery, accountability, and growth. It wasn't easy. Every step forced her to confront parts of herself she'd ignored for years, but with Rachel's guidance and a determination she hadn't known she possessed, Sarah began to rebuild. She launched a blog, Flying Beyond Bias, sharing her journey from prejudice to accountability. She wrote candidly about the flight, the Carters, and the lessons she'd learned, not shying away from the ugly parts. The response was overwhelming. Readers connected with her honesty, leaving comments about their own struggles with bias and change. A small publisher reached out, proposing a book based on her story. Soaring Above Prejudice hit shelves in 2027, a modest success that found its way into the hands of those seeking inspiration. Sarah partnered with Rachel to host small workshops in Brooklyn, teaching individuals how to recognize and overcome bias in their daily lives. They kept it simple, intimate groups, practical advice, no grand stages or spotlights. Sarah wasn't a celebrity or a savior, she was just a woman who'd fallen and chosen to rise differently. She reconnected with old friends, including Emily, meeting her for coffee one afternoon to apologize sincerely for her past behavior. "I knew there was more to you than what I saw that day," Emily said, smiling. "I'm glad you're proving me right." The Carters stayed in Sarah's thoughts, their calm strength a silent guide for how she approached her new life. One day, she sat down and wrote them a letter. She thanked them for forcing her to confront the parts of herself she'd ignored, apologized for the pain she'd caused, and wished them well. She mailed it without expecting a reply, the act itself a final step in taking responsibility. Years later, at one of her workshops, Sarah stood before a small crowd in a community center. She shared her story, the flight, the fall, the slow climb back, not with shame, but with hope. As the attendees listened, nodding and asking questions, she thought of Olivia Carter's question, 15 years, and what have you learned? Now, she had an answer. She'd learned humility, accountability, and the power of second chances. She'd learned that failure didn't have to be the end, it could be the beginning of something better. As the group applauded, Sarah smiled, not the polished smile of her flight attendant days, but one born of hard-earned growth. Her journey wasn't over, but it was hers, and that was enough.